Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. When I say that my guest here, who is just looking at me with such excited and eager eyes on the Zoom screen, is someone who I just hold really deep in my heart. And I always have a special place for my guests, but I've known this guest since 2019 at least. And we just had such a bond, and we'll probably open up about that. And just we had a beautiful conversation every time that I would see her. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the creative genius, in my opinion, that is Lindsay Tuggle, who is the author of The Afterlives of Specimens from 2017, which is a really beautifully done Whitmanic, Walt Whitman academic book, but also explores her creativity as well. I feel you're going between both worlds. So I think that'll be a good opening for us to talk about academic versus creative writing. And, are there really differences or can you intersect them? It was glowingly reviewed by the New York Review of Books. Um, Commonplace and American Literary History all have glowing reviews of her book. And then I was talking to Lindsay before I hit record. I absolutely love her debut poetry collection. And I'm going to say the Kentuckian way, which is Calenture from 2018, is such a beautiful collection. And it was named one of the Australians' books of the year and shortlisted for the Association for the Study of Australian Literature's Mary Gilmore Award and Australian Poetry's Anne Elder Award. So Lindsay's work has appeared in so many venues, from the New York Review of Books, the North American Review, the Walt Whitman Quarterly Review. He Rabbit Poetry. I just wanted to read that. Red Room Poetry, Commonplace, Anthology of Contemporary Australian Feminist Poetry. And she's won so many grants and fellowships, from the Library of Congress to the Mutter Museum in my nearby Philadelphia, where I grew up. And also, she is coming to us straight from, or still in, uh, her writer in residency in Champaign. And I'll have her actually pronounce the name so I don't butcher it. But Lindsay, without further ado, it means so much that you're here in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Andrew, it's a delight, and it's been one of the great delights of my academic career to just watch you flourish and watch what you've created with this podcast. It's really an accomplishment. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, first, how long are you in this writer in residency?
It actually just finished. It
Oh,
was the month of September.
okay.
So I was in Chateau Orquevaux, which is in Champagne. And it's a really extraordinary residency program. It's very interdisciplinary and very geographically diverse. So they try to have a mix of different creative practitioners, visual artists, writers, performance artists, filmmakers, musicians, and people from different ages, different ethnicities, different geographic locations. So it's just this incredible kind of prism of creativity, where I was sort of incubating for the last month, and I'm still a little bit in the afterglow.
Well, I know we'll open up more about the afterglow and just how you're processing that September experience. I think first, I've just always been so interested in your work, but even let's go before your published work, which is the Lindsay Tuggle who decided to um, go get a PhD. Like, do you remember what was going through your mind when you realized, okay, this is what I want to do now in my academic journey? Like, there's something pulling me towards it. Like, do you remember what was pulling you towards a PhD?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange biographical turn. It's not without tragedies and sort of 90-degree U-turns. But my many years ago, my first career was in social work and trauma social work. And at a certain stage in that, I had a bereavement. My sister died, and the nature of the work I was doing was really confronting. So I knew I was on the threshold of burnout. And so I took some time and ended up in Australia. And then I sort of just didn't leave, and ended up going back to school. I thought I had the realization that I just wasn't in a place where I could continue with the kind of work, which was gender violence advocacy work and working with survivors, that I thought would be my life's work. And I didn't really say, oh, I can't do this forever, but I certainly knew for the foreseeable future it was a little bit beyond me. So I went back to school thinking I might like to teach high school English, and started doing English literature courses at the University of Sydney, and then just kept going and just kept going. And when I finished what we call an honors, which is kind of like a miniature master's in US academic lexicon, the opportunity came to apply for a scholarship for the PhD. And I thought, well, I'll apply, and if I get it, then that's a sign. And that's how I got there.
Oh, wow. Well, something just now, even having my diploma and that official glow of the PhD, like, oh, wow, I am Dr. Rimby, or, you are Dr. Tuggle, right? Is that your maiden name, Lindsay?
It is,
Okay,
yes.
okay. Just want to make sure because on your screen I see Sloan and I'm like, wait, I hope
No,
I'm
yeah,
getting
you're
the time
absolutely
period
right.
right.
Yeah, I'm still Tuggle in all my writing life and all my professional life. But I do kind of have this sort of secret private name, which I quite love. Like, I didn't think that would be a thing that I would ever be interested in. But somehow, when we finally decided to get married, which is not a podcast conversation, I thought, well, I think I'd really like to have a whole other person in my private life, whole other identity. So yeah, sorry for the
No, I
creepy.
love that. It's like the anonymity. It makes sense. But something that I've been conscious of, and I would love, your thoughts on it is, and everyone did tell me, and I was very mindful and aware every celebration or graduation moment, even the defense, like, thank goodness I got permission to record the presentation and I have it on YouTube. Like, I have all the markers presented. But after, right, you receive the diploma and then you think, wait, I did it. Like, it was like, wait, this was 9 years of my life. And I went right from my undergrad, Lindsay. This is 12 years I was in college. And what is Andrew Rimby without college? And like, there was a whole month of, I mean, I'm still questioning things, but thank goodness I have this business that I created. But it is a moment of, wait, do I just keep applying? Do I have to be at a university? And then when it came into my mind, oh, no one's forcing me to be at a university. That was where I got this degree. But look at all the skills you've amassed, Andrew. But it's that industry of the university. It is such a pull after your PhD, in my opinion. And it can be very frightening to your identity as an academic, I feel, when you realize that you might not be at a university and to try to come to your own terms with that. I mean, is that something that speaks to you, Lindsay?
Hugely, it's incredibly resonant. And I'm once again, as I said before we formally started, you are on a trajectory that's light years ahead of some of the realizations that I had, as an early career researcher. And I think there is a sense in which we must be a bit more transparent about what the institution can offer and about the context in which it can do great harm to doctoral students, to early career researchers. There are extraordinary gifts and generous mentors, but the institutions themselves at the moment, I think many of them are failing our doctoral students and our early career researchers, whether by intention or by benign neglect or by direct harm. And I think one of the ways in which that failure occurs, one of the more benign ways, is not being transparent about what jobs are available, and also about not teaching our early career researchers, how applicable their skill set is beyond the ivory tower. And that's why I think the work that you're doing is so groundbreaking and important, you know.
Well,
Um,
that really warms my heart. I mean, Lindsay, it's true because like I'm even having tears in my eyes right now because it's not just you're confirming, like validating what I'm doing, but to realize everything you're saying of the harm of the institution. I always say now, especially after getting my PhD, there are not specific people who harmed or who I would pass blame to. I had such a wonderful department. I always say I loved my director, and I still have such a good relationship with her and the committee. It's not that, it's
yeah.
like you said, the organization. And I think sometimes in the university, people are so nervous to speak out because they think that they're blaming individual people. But the failure of an organization or of any industry is not about one person. And it's like the writer's strike or even reality TV stars wanting a union. Like that's not about specific people. That's about this institution hasn't supported all of our creativity and endeavors. And we want more. Like we demand more respect. And that's how I so feel with academia right now is you keep saying that the humanities teaches your undergrads and graduate students how to work outside of the university. But is this reflected in the actual, like you said, the methodology, the learning tools, like, do you have people from different industries in your faculty, or are they like coming to do presentations and workshops? And I feel like there's still such a separation of this is what happens in the bubble of the university, and then this is the outside world. Well, we want you to be in the outside world after this degree. Good luck. It's very hard to understand, you know, how the administrations are constructing the role of the university right now, in my opinion. Like, it's great. Like you said, it's great to go for a PhD, but you need to be honest with the students and not just train them for academic jobs. Like, you need to now train them for media jobs, for publication jobs, for, I don't know, legal jobs, for anyone who has a PhD in English, find them in industries. I
Mm.
mean, that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I think the thing that is really, critical for me is that anyone who emerges from a PhD in literature, for example, because that's what we know best, has, these close reading skills, these skills of argumentation, these skills of long form analysis, whether that's reading analysis or writing analysis, that are incredibly valuable and increasingly rare. So that's already happening. What is, I think, often not happening is teaching those young scholars or those emerging scholars how to articulate those skills in a market, because we don't like to think of ourselves as being in a market, right? And it's a shame that we are, but this is all kind of intrinsic on, I think, part of the fact that many universities depend so much on unpaid labor. Whether that's the unpaid labor of graduate students or early career scholars and teachers who are, just not paid for a lot of the work that they do, or whether that's tenured professors who are now working such long hours that, it takes them 7 days a week. It's sort of ubiquitous. And so I think this sort of denial of a value is like it's a systemic problem, and it links up with other systemic problems like the writers' strike, that you reference.
And once you're outside the university, right? And I'm seeing this now with how I'm negotiating with sponsors or negotiating now in my consulting business that I'm doing with the podcast. And I'm like helping someone right now with their thesis. And, just realizing, you know, I would love to say that money is not a concern, but you start to realize that time is such a value. And like, that's why I'm so transparent here, Lindsay, that, Lindsay decided to come on here, you know, for free, but like we're both, helping support one another, like artistically and creatively. And I think it's so good to just be transparent. And I don't know, I'm all about communication and honesty. I think if people were just honest, like now I've had to decline some things in more academic venues just because I realized, wait, these types of opportunities are more for full-time faculty where they have funds from their department to pay for this. But when you're an independent scholar or on the outside, you have to fund this yourself. Like I am trying to find, luckily, there are grants to help support my business that I'm going to start to apply for. And I am going to start to go to conferences. I'm going to the MLA in January. Yeah, yeah. Um, and I actually got invited to speak about my podcast, like in one of their presentation rooms. So, what I'm doing now is if I go to a conference, I've just decided it has to make sense with the work I do, but also connecting back to the media space I'm in. Like, it needs to be an ivory tower boiler room
Mhm.
discussion or talk. And like, I even am probably going to a Gothic um, symposium in March in Salem to cover, because I had this whole idea that I want to cover interviews in real time. Like, wouldn't it be great if there was an on the ground media presence at a conference who had short interviews with or with those who want to talk about their work they're doing there? Just because I always feel in academia, we're always missing the after effect of a conference. Like, why not have an archive? Like, why not tell the public what happens here? And I realized, well, you know what, Lindsay, this is the best place for me because I get to dictate the terms because we don't have a model. Like, we don't have a red carpet in academia and all these outlets. It's a whole new space for us.
And you're so right that we do have to start, we do have to start to shift beyond the borders, and I think what really resonates with me with what you're saying, like I think of myself these days as a recovering academic. That's my little 12-step joke. But it resonates a lot with people. And even with myself, you talk about the pull of the ivory tower. I made the decision to leave the university. I'm trying to do the math here, around about 6 or 7 years after my PhD. And, it was a little bit like giving up something that you love a great deal, but that isn't always good for you. And it was a slow burn and there was some push and pull, at the end of the day, for me, part of the realization was in having like some encounters with my own mortality and with the fragility of the physical body, and realizing, in a very, and I think being schooled in Whitman kind of primes you for this, right? To think of the decaying body as transcendent, and the human body is always, in a state of both decay and regeneration. And I'm sitting with that and sitting on all of those, decades of Whitman research, and realizing I don't want to claw out space for my poetry between 4 and 7 a.m. anymore. Like I'm unwilling, and I've got, long form projects that I want to write. Like I'm writing a novel right now, that I'm just never going to be able to do in this particular ecosystem. But having that realization and actually being able to leave, whether that's like psychologically or whether it's financially, and I think as a poet, as a writer, as a creative, you've got to kind of be real with people about that stuff as well, because it's all super hard, and we all have to eat, we have to pay rent, we have to have day jobs. Part of the danger, and the thing that makes us vulnerable is that we are doing this work out of love. And whenever that's your primary motivation, someone can exploit that, if we're not savvy, if we're not, kind of keeping an eye.
Oh, yes. Work jobs that I feel we all should be passionate in the work we do, but when your whole career is based around the passion of the study of that object in front of you, it's so ripe for manipulation by negative actors.
Mhm.
And I think just realizing, oh, it's not me. Like I I've gotten away from that failure mentality or like Andrew, you did something, um you had to validate yourself and you just didn't do a good enough sales pitch of validating yourself to the university. And then I said, wait, the jobs just aren't there. I mean, to be realistic here, also the jobs are there, but the jobs that are there are ones that I feel you're getting really low pay right now for doing 4 to 5 classes a semester teaching. And like you said, I thought, wait, Andrew, there's no way you could continue to have your business. Like, it just isn't feasible. And I thought, well, maybe I should be an entrepreneur. Like, I already am. Why not just hit full throttle and go for it? And see, this is the way I feel, Lindsay, is this is the time now for me to just be as creative as possible and take a chance on myself. Because if I don't do this now, no one's ever going to say to me, Andrew, why don't you go back to that project and business you started? Like things, distractions happen, life, happens. And I'm lucky enough that I have funds right now to just help support me through this growing period. And I always think the university's door is open. It's not like it's shut behind me, but I do feel now it would have to be a place that really values my talents and my work. And I'm not going to keep begging, like, I'm not going to just send out applications because I feel that I need that validation from the university. And it's right, it's tough because I never want to sound like an embittered employee or a scorned lover, but we have to do what's like you said, you just felt the burnout happening. And I also felt that during my PhD. I mean, I love what I've learned from my PhD and my dissertation, and I wouldn't have started this business without it. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. But it's like you said, what Whitman had taught me or queer poetics taught me is how to reach the LGBTQ community out there, like everyone listening right now who's part of that community. It helped me reach you, like them. It's realizing what you can do with that academic talent, but then making it fit your lifestyle and I'm telling you, Lindsay, being an entrepreneur with flexible hours, there's a lot of the financial obstacles are always going to be there, but there is so much freedom of creativity. It's like probably the way you feel right now with your finishing the writer in residence and just that energy, you know.
And look, again, there's just so much intersectionality between our experiences, although it just maybe took me a little bit longer to wake up to it. But, I think this realization that you you look at a particular opportunity like a job application, or even once I left the university and was pursuing writing full time, I would look at grant applications for writers, or various residencies, and I made a decision right in the middle, right as COVID was beginning. It wasn't related to COVID, that I was no longer going to apply for things where the application process was so intensive that I could have gone off and made a body of work. Not a poem. Poems can take a really long time. Sometimes that's just their kind of germination process. But if I could have gone away and written an essay or a chapter of my novel, in the amount of time or for the same kind of composite words as what an application was asking of me, I just decided to vote with my feet. And there's absolutely a degree of privilege in that. I also resonate with the conference thing that you said. my partner sort of was so incredulous at this. You pay to work, you pay to go and go and do this, So I think like getting real with yourself about what is valuable and what context you want to move through. And I have to say, like, I'm so happy to hear you say that you're leaning hard into the media and the entrepreneurial spirit, because when you were emerging with your degree, I thought, oh, I really hope Andrew is able to keep going with the podcast and the community that's growing around it. Like, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. I've said to you before, but it is breaking down these barriers that are what you call the ivory tower, we call the sandstone university, and showing the ways in which the work that we do, it is resonant for people. And it's a question of translation. It's a question of not being constrained by those borders.
Yes. And having to access, like you're writing, right? You said you're writing a novel right now. You think of audience. These are questions that of reach, who you're reaching out to, that you really learn how to. I really, I'll say it right now. I dislike that phrase, dumbing down anything. I find it an offensive phrase. I also just think that we're selling ourselves short to think that people of all different education levels or professions or the people you just meet in your day-to-day life, they will understand. It's about how we connect. How do you find common ground of what they're bringing to the table and what you're bringing to the table? And there was a part of me, there is a congratulatory pat on the back that I've observed in universities, and it's a part that I had to unpack, which is like when I say that validation from the university, I mean just that, which I'm sure you can recognize that behavior as well. It's only speaking a certain language of lexicon terminology, and I'm thinking this is not really like, maybe that makes you feel that um your ego has mastered a certain level of knowledge, but I feel that with all of our knowledge and education, shouldn't we not be trying to seek out the same people? Shouldn't we be seeking out the people who would love to read, but they just haven't maybe found the right book, or they're not sure how to access the public library? Like, once you open their mind to, oh, that novel, Lindsay, you're working on, what a great premise. Like, that plot sounds fascinating. And I feel because of my podcast, I'm always talking about guests I've had on to anyone I'm encountering, and they always will say, oh, I'll have to look up that person's work or that book. And it does, in my opinion, this is the work I've wanted to do, which is also to spread the love of arts and culture, because I feel like we're very deeply in need of not just those who will always find arts and culture because they'll always exist. The bibliophiles will be there as a small subsection always. Even in the dark ages, I'm sure they were there.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's the people who are always consuming arts and culture, but they're haven't latched on to or had the light bulb moment of that's what I'm doing. Like, just to even be cognizant and aware. I love spreading that awareness because it ripples.
It's so true. And I think, I mean, my favorite teaching experience that I ever had was something I did with Red Room Project, Red Room Poetry in Australia, which was where we went in and taught poetry workshops in prisons. And it was literally a transformative experience for me. I worked with young male offenders age 18 to 25. And I really came up against my own biases and expectations. We put together, and we really weren't sure, like, what's going to be the portal. And we worked very closely with their teachers, their literacy and language teachers, who kind of applied for the funding to have this project. And, they were very clear with us that, it needs to be something that they can find, like a reciprocal mirror or a way to get, a passage in. So we looked at anthologies that had come out of other prisons. We looked at poetry that had been written in various kinds of enclosure or incarceration. And what I found very quickly was what they responded to was you being real and personal and vulnerable. And so we wrote poetry together. And, we did kind of like exquisite corpse style things where each person writes a line. And the more fragile you were willing to be, the greater they would meet you there. But the most extraordinary thing that I sort of realized is, I'd put together a lot of texts that I thought would be relatable to them. And of all the things that we read, the thing they most responded to was the poet Anne Carson's long elegy for her brother Knox. And there's a particular line in there: always a comfort to know there is a secret behind what torments you. And this was the poem, because there are these kind of one-line poems with collages, and they each wrote a response to that poem, and many of the students acknowledged this as being the most generative of all the exercises that we did. And Anne Carson is a feminist classicist, and this is who they also loved Susan Howell because she's writing all over the page, so I think you're absolutely right. Like, the issue is not with the art. The issue is with how we talk about the art. And are we creating these barriers? Because, and I say we when really not you and I, but is academia creating barriers that don't actually exist? And if so, why? As opposed to, creating a portal or a through line.
Well, it's kind of, I don't know how it was at University of Sydney, right, Lindsay? Is that okay? I'm assuming that's one of the largest universities in Sydney. Right? Like, do you remember how many students are at University of Sydney? Like an estimate?
I am terrible with numbers, so
Oh, okay.
I'm going to ballpark that. For a Civil War scholar, I have to always check my dates. I'm just not a numbers person. But yeah, it's one of Australia's largest universities. So there's sort of these, what we call the sandstone universities, that are kind of like the Ivies. And so it would
Okay.
be in that category.
Wait, why is it called sandstone? I have to ask.
They're made out of sandstone. They're very beautiful. And so they, like, I think in the States, it would depend where geographically you are, what kind of stone an old 19th century or 18th century building would be made of. But in Australia, it's almost always sandstone. That's just what we've got.
Yeah. Well, luckily, to help find our numbers, we have Google, and I just saw 73,000. Um 73,000, and I already see photos of University of Sydney. And it's a public university. Okay. See, that's um you know, do you feel that the Australian system, because you've, been in both, right? If everyone out there doesn't know, because of Lindsay's, what I call more of a transatlantic accent, just from all your journeying and being in the States, being in Australia, now, you're in France, but or you've been in France. Is there a big difference between the American system, in your opinion, and like the European, Australian, when it comes to these boundaries you're talking about?
Um, Most definitely. I think I can't speak too much to the European context, although I do have a very dear friend, Stephanie Schaefer, who I met. We were both at the Library of Congress as Kluge Fellows a decade ago. And we just sort of like fell into each other's lives in a really adhesive way. and has stayed.
Borrowing a Whitman term.
There's a lot of adhesiveness there. And so I was with her in Germany right before I went to Champagne for the residency. So I have a glimpse through her experience and also through another friend of ours, Ilaria Andrioli, who's based in Paris. And Stephanie also is doing a podcast. Her podcast is called The Transatlanticist. So, there's some I think through lines with what you're doing, and I think a little bit more of a sense because in Europe there is much more public funding and much more of a sense of this is this is a endeavor that has benefit and that is expected to have benefit for the collective. I think in America there's an absence sometimes of collectivist thinking. Australia is a bit of a strange beast because in theory, the universities are public, but because we've had so many funding cuts for decades from both sides of government, like we have a real kind of anti-intellectual strain in Australian culture and politics that crosses both sides of politics. Our Labor Party comes out of the union movement, and they've also cut funding pretty drastically in the decades that I've lived there. So because of that, the universities have kind of somewhat privatized by offering degrees, whether they're international degrees or a portion of degrees locally that are for full fee paying students. And how that's changed since I left the institution, I can't really speak to. But it does create this kind of hybrid model. And I think, in Australia, yes, there's definitely a sense in which I think we could do better, or I say we, and I'm not really part of the institution anymore, but academia could do better at articulating the ways in which our research, our teaching is valuable and intrinsic to like collective good, to societal good.
Yeah. And I know myself, you're also so interested in not only abstract boundaries of creative ideas, but also setting. Like I really feel geography and just how a place is located really does impact the public's awareness. So even say a Stony Brook University, it's so interesting to me because it's almost like um Rutgers in a way where they're just very self-contained and they're not really in the community. And I do feel that that really sets a tone. Um, and again, the community also is responsible for that. Like some communities really don't want uh students around their stores, which I don't understand because that doesn't help the economy. But uh but then like I went back recently to my undergrad in North Jersey and it's called Kane and it's like right in Union and it's only 25 minutes from Manhattan. The train is on campus. I mean, it was idyllic being there and going back and seeing, the nostalgia was wonderful. But like they've built this whole condos around the campus and all of the restaurants. And even when you're not even on campus and you're in the town, Lindsay, they have flags for Kane University everywhere in their downtown. And I'm like, that to me, it's like Rowan. I'm not sure if you know that university, but I grew up near there in South Jersey. And it's the same thing. Like students can use their money at all the restaurants and grocery stores. And I think, and they are public, but Stony Brook is public, but it just doesn't have, I think it's maybe the Research One university distinction compared to teaching schools. And I always was around teaching colleges, and there is a difference in my opinion. Like I feel research universities, they're trying to make themselves known to the public, but I do think they could learn a lot from teaching colleges and from ones who really are the fabric of their community, like where people in the community go to the university all the time because they're attending performances or they're attending lectures for the public. Like that's like you're saying, that's where the university can step in and have more public courses. Like I always think, why aren't academics at the public libraries? Like there's so many ways, or the cafes, right? Having like a round table, like things that are for the public, but also you're still representing your department.
Yeah, and it sort of like it gives me a bit of an entryway to talk about the Matter Museum that you mentioned in the intro, and kind of what's happening there, because it's so relevant just to the way the conversation is flowing for us. You know, I was so lucky to have 3 research fellowships at the Matter Museum. The first 2 were for Afterlives, which was my nonfiction book. The third was actually applied purely as a poet to go in and work with part of these 3 books that are part of their collection of anthropodermic books, which are books bound in human skin.
Wow.
And I had written about that phenomenon in Afterlives because I'm thinking a lot in that book about how the 19th century related to the human body, both as an object of scientific or anatomical material and as a beloved ghost, you know, how we mourn. But there were so many, as I was researching Afterlives, and one of the most valuable things that the PhD gave me was the ability to go and do archival research and be in the physical presence of someone else's creative process. You know, that was just, I'll be forever grateful for that. But at the Motor Museum, you know, I had the capacity to work with these texts as both a scholar and a creative. And it was game changing like that. The last half of Calenture is a suite of poems called An Elementary Treatise on Human Anatomy that were inspired by the archives at the Motor Museum. The title, Calenture, is actually a 19th century medical diagnosis, and it's specifically a tropical fever that afflicted sailors who suffered from a very specific hallucination. They saw the sea as a green field, and they would leap overboard and drown because their desire for that grassy mirage was so great. And you can imagine the Whitmanian correlations that I found there. And
Yeah, the grass. Yes.
really interesting moments in my own biography. Like the first time I read the word, I'm sitting in the reading room at the Matter Museum, and I was reading about, stumbled across this in a book of 19th century medical diseases, like a sort of encyclopedia. And I had this vision of my sister, my late sister Amanda, diving from the cliffs into this lake called Katawa, near where we lived. And that particular summer, there was an algal bloom, so the water was incredibly green. And I'm just sort of arrested by this image, and I knew that that would become a book in that moment. You know, at the time that I was there, the Motor Museum had an extraordinary director, Robert Hicks, who's become a phenomenal mentor and dear friend of mine. And he was extraordinary in opening the collections to artists, to writers, to filmmakers. And not only that, he would take Civil War medical kits and go to public schools in inner city Philadelphia and do a Civil War medical clinic. So he'd give the students a list of symptoms, and they got to be, you know, the soldier with gangrene who's going to need his arm amputated, or with dysentery. You know, he would have hospital day at the museum, where he would turn the museum into a hospital and bring all these students in. He was about breaking down those borders. In the last 6 months, for reasons that are baffling and mysterious to many of us who have loved that institution, the CEO, who's just stepped down, and the new director are trying to close the museum to anyone but doctors. They've removed the entire YouTube channel. They've removed many of the specimens that were donated by people with an intention and a bequest that people learn from these specimens. So there's a real sense of a kind of inversion of what you and I are talking about, of going from an institution that is so open And there's a real sense, it's something else that I think is so important to both you and I, which is a sense of the body's transcendence, the body's capacity for, a kind of Whitmanian ecstatic grace. And how we come to that is always an encounter with our mortality. So many people talk about, people who've worked in the museum talk about people coming there when they've gotten a cancer diagnosis. I myself went there with my best friend who had survived brain cancer and sat there or stood there looking at the brain specimens and looking at her. And it's one of the most profound moments of my life, So it's an institution that can have such a profound impact on people. And yet we're going into this place of closing off as opposed to, rant over.
No. This is so just poignant, and palpably, I can feel that pain in your voice. I mean, it's what I thought when the Met Art Museum decided that they were going to now stop the pay what you wish unless you're a New York resident. And I thought, so if you're in New Jersey, now you have to pay the set fee. Connecticut, it just did not. And I think that any pay what you wish, it brought in so many. I would even just go to the art museum for an hour and be like, well, I paid $5 and I just want to see this one room. And now, you know, not even just because of that, you know, change in decision because I can pay what I wish. I'm a New York resident, but I want to take friends. And then I realize, wait, no, they're now limited by the pay. And I understand boards make decisions and there's financial issues right now with keeping these institutions alive. But I just wish there was a like you've said, why can't we have a collective vision of these organizations? And that saddens me to hear about the Mutter Museum because it's a place that so many of my friends and anyone in the Philly area rave about it. I mean, it's up there with one of my favorite music. I mean, Philly, I was back in Philly recently, Lindsay, and I was in Society Hill and Head House Square, one of my favorite neighborhoods. Like anyone who's out there who's like, near Philly or goes to Philly, I always say Old City, Society Hill, Queen Village, Washington Square West, journeying to Rittenhouse. There's just such a heart in Philly. And it's there in New York, but it's I call it the little sibling to New York. It has all New York's charm, but it's just concentrated. And you
That's
always
such
talk
a
to
good
new
way.
people.
Yeah.
They're just so friendly. I mean, New Yorkers are friendly too, but I think it's just so neighborhoody. And
It,
yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope that the Mutter Museum, I'm assuming there's a lot of pressure on them now from
yeah, so I'll say
those
a
like
couple of
you.
important things about that. The first one is that the campaign Protect the Mutter, find them on Instagram. There's a petition via their Instagram. You'll be able to get to that petition. It's already got 30 something thousand signatures. There have been articles in the Washington Post, the Guardian, the New York Times, all the major Philadelphia newspapers and media outlets. And the CEO has stepped down as a result of it. That happened just last week. So I'm certainly no expert. I've been watching this from afar with great trauma. But the friends of the Mutter, the Mutter kind of cohort of morbidly curious people are definitely all over it. So, anyone who's concerned can find them that way. And I think there's room for optimism for sure.
Yes. And it's also why I feel like a good future vision is when museums have joined forces and you can be a member to multiple museums. Like they're reciprocal. I've gone to the Mount, Edith Wharton's home, in the Berkshires. Have you been there, Lindsay?
No.
Oh, that's a
And
place that
she's my
you'll,
favorite 19th century novelist, so I need to
yes,
go.
yes. They have a writer's residency. Um, yeah, you'll have to add it to your list. So what I love is they're also part of like the Nassau County Art Museum that's near me, and all of these museums. They've all joined like the North American Reciprocal Organization. That's not exact NARM. Yeah, I think it's North American Reciprocal Museums. But I hope that that's our future because I feel that these places need to join forces. And that's actually brings us back to academia, which is they need to join forces with writers and
Mhm.
artists and performers and media people, like to just, I always say not every academic needs to start a podcast nor um needs to put themselves out there if they're uncomfortable. Like I never have a dictum like you need to do exactly this venue because you open
Mhm.
yourself up to criticism and the social media space, which, I get naysayers, but I'm also ready for this.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm sure Lindsay, something I did want to ask as we're nearing our end, which I'm always going to talk with you on our off time here. We'll always have our conversations, but for the audience out there, which I'm sure there are those listening who are contemplating their next steps, they're maybe feeling insecure in their jobs, they realize they want to go into a different endeavor. How do you look back now on the naysayers or those who maybe even questioned you going full time as a creative writer? Like, how do you reflect back on the critics in your life and get through it? How do you get through the criticism?
Yeah, so I think um, there's a line by the poet Diana Falls that I'm not at home right now, but when I'm at home, it is taped above my desk. Perfection is not a prerequisite for anything but pain.
Mm,
And I think one of the most damaging through lines of like the rigors of peer review and academic research and things like that is that if you have that kind of perfectionistic tendency, it will really turn the volume up, or that kind of imposter syndrome tendency. I, I actually, when I finally was deciding to leave, it was an Australian poet who I won't name because I haven't cleared this with him, but who was also an academic, but he had made the decision many years ago to go down to half-time because it wasn't possible for him to write while doing a full-time teaching load, the output that he wanted to create. And he really said to me, you know, you're probably going to have to choose. So I did have some really good guidance in that sense, but there were also a number of people who probably thought I was a bit crazy. And, I'm always a bit careful with synchronicity narratives, right? Because it's very difficult to be an optimist in the world that we're in right now. And it can be dangerous. I think synchronicity narratives or manifestation narratives can be really dangerous.
mm,
Um, Having said that, because there are incredible difficulties and hardships that we all are going to face. Having said all of that, when I just gave myself permission to be a writer who writes and to own that, and I started putting that on everything I did. So if I have to enter the country, I'll put writer as my occupation. That's what's on my tax. I started to actually identify this as a profession and as a job and take some of the mystery out of it. I quietly love books about creativity, even though I don't always enjoy them. And one of my favorites which is some real tough love, is The War of Art. Um, and one of the things that Pressfield talks about in that book is the sense in which you have to treat it like a job, you know. And there's a magic, there's an alchemy, there are these moments of real transcendent grace when you're in flow state and things just happen. But there's also the sense of just dragging your ass out of bed at 5 a.m. or whatever time and just sort of doing the work. And I think in terms of the critics or the people who doubted that decision, for me, many of them came from a place of love, and those are the hardest critics to sort of tangle with, because I think they were concerned that I was giving up, whatever semblance of security we can have in these institutions, which is, that's debatable, for something that was very, very insecure. And, that is something that I still struggle with, that doubt. But then things just sort of happen, like the residency at Workville, and I had another writer's residency earlier this year in Australia, at Bundanon Trust, which is a really extraordinary art gallery and national park that was bequeathed to Australia by one of our most important painters, Arthur Boyd, of the mid-century. So, things have kind of happened as I have owned that as a profession, as opposed to an art form. So I think that's probably, if that answers your question, been an important distinction for me, is to say, yes, I create poetry, I create fiction, I create creative nonfiction, but it's my profession to do that,
And that you can hold all sides of your creative self, like to realize that you are in control of telling your own narrative. Like I felt once I was able to explain the narrative to myself, it doesn't matter now if someone's questioning how I'm living my life, because they're living in an old model and that's on them. And like you said, they want to come from love. It is always usually from their fear of you not being secure in what they think is um, a traditional model. And,
Mhm.
you know, one of my last questions to follow up with you on what you've just said, Lindsay, is do you feel that when it comes to censoring ideas or being more free flowing and allowing yourself to take vulnerable risks in your writing, do you find that your creative voice or just your writerly voice, not just creative writing, but nonfiction writing, is stronger now than it was when you were at a university?
Yeah, for sure. I even, like I was, and it's interesting because there is space and there are some extraordinary scholars who are creating this space, like I got asked late 2020, I think it was, by Ken Price and Stefan Schoberlein to be part of the Oxford Handbook of Walt Whitman. And they were really kind in allowing me or inviting me to write about the intersection between my poetry and my scholarly work on Whitman. But as I came to approach that essay and think about how those two things were intertwined for me in ways that are really kind of impossible to untangle, the town that I grew up in, which is where my family still lives, of Mayfield, Kentucky, was devastated by a tornado. Like the center, the old historic center of the town, and huge swaths of it were just wiped off the map. And that became really enmeshed with my thinking about Whitmanian elegy and the collective and how we mourn a place, and how we mourn not just in singularity, but how we can be hospitable to, the bodies of so many beloveds, right? And I found that it just wasn't possible for me to not write, to be writing in that space and not write that. So I approached them and said, could I weave this in? And they allowed me to write what is a very personal essay, about my relationship with Whitman, about living through this loss in real time, and, I sort of sent the page proofs off, the final edits, while I was at Workville, and I called my mom and I said, I've written our little backwater Kentucky town into Oxford. So there is space for that. There are extraordinary people making space for that. Sometimes you have to ask for it, because it's a little bit outside the box. But yes, I think, but the me that would even ask that question, can I do this? Was if I was still at the university, I wouldn't have asked the question. I would have just written the brief they asked me to write. So there is a freedom in being the master of my own, output and creative world, as you well know, that gives you that kind of emboldens you to say, I'd really rather do it this way.
Or like if you feel you have to keep begging for an opportunity, and that's not, it is, it's a value of, I know my work and my art, and I can tell if someone wants to collaborate and they're a good actor in this endeavor and we're helping each other. But there's opportunities where you feel that it's coming out of an egotistical battle. And I'm like, Andrew, this is not worth
Yeah.
your stress level. Like, if you feel you have to defend or explain why you're doing what you're doing, then that's not right for you right now in the universe. Let it go. Because the
Absolutely.
opportunity comes again, something does come along, I feel.
Yeah,
It's
when you make that space, it's extraordinary what will fill it, what will come to the surface to fill it. Like one of my other favorite books about writing is Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, which you would probably really love if you haven't read it.
I'm gonna add it. Yeah, yeah.
And she, it's sort of workbook, so you go through week by week. And you get to a particular week, this may put everybody off, but don't be put off. That's reading deprivation week, where you're actually not allowed to read or consume any story. And in the, this was written in a more analog age, but you can do that to whatever degree is possible for you or that you're willing or capable of engaging with. But, for that week, you're not allowed to read, to watch, to consume stories, to see what kind of comes up in your own. And it is this magic, extraordinarily birthing painful, but this hugely generative act that I will do periodically. So yeah.
So I know that, Lindsay, you had prepared either, I think, one or two poems, and I thought if you could read one of your poems right now, it would be such a treat just for myself to hear, the audience to hear. Um, and I'd love to make space for that because this is just, I feel it's the cherry on top of a really powerful conversation. So thank you for, agreeing to read one of your poems.
Oh, it's an honor and a delight. I've got one ready here called The Specimen Dream. And this, you'll notice a nod to Whitman in the title. That's both a nod to Whitman's specimen soldiers that he tended during the Civil War, and those extraordinarily erotic and transcendent and convalescent relationships that he had. It's also a bit of a dig at Freud. And it does a kind of similar work to Whitman, but in a very different way. So part of the collection that I'm currently working on, which is called the Autopsy Elegies, and the idea of it came out of that work I did with the human skin bound books at the Motor Museum, and thinking about all of these through lines of violence that as women we inherit, to the degree that they become both banal and deeply traumatic, but they also can be, in a sense, unifying experiences. And so that's sort of what this poem is about. Although, having said that, I really prefer to think of poetry as being a bit untranslatable. Like that's the reason why I think we create art, is to translate something that's outside of linear language. So I sort of prefer poetry to be a little bit like a conversation you overheard in a dream you half remember. It feels true in a way that burrows into your bones, even if you can't quite pinpoint why. So this poem is pretty new, and it's called The Specimen Dream. Everyone was talking about the weather the year we learned to fear touch. We were so lovely and unharmed a girl ago. Oracles marked by fits and starts, fluent only in rapture. Slow-limbed and grass-stained, amnesiac after the first sip. This is the new past, a steady progression of scars and acolytes. Transience is essential to our survival. Wanting to go all out, we settled on strict rations, a diet of mirage and cured meats. Regarding suffering, she said, it's all in the technique. Now our wounds glow like radium girls, green-sleeved, half-lived, radiant as ghosts on their way home. We are still paying for our own atrocity tours. Pastel girls, bellwether violent ends, hewn in so many bodies of water. Their limbs never felt the blank space where another body once rested. So much depends on preserving the stain of their dirty feet against white sheets. We inherit their glassine eyes and brittle bones, their unmade beds of hair, their way of standing perfectly still. All our borrowed gestures of protection for winter, for warmth, echo the clouds of their breath in the cold. We do not ask to see their fate or ours. It is not always better to know. Aftermaths are trauma's fingerprints, always beckoning. Indelible as laughter in the hippocampus, a face so familiar, it threatens to shatter the screen you fumble to pocket. When the fires won't light and the rituals hearken only despair, keep your dead well covered and your prophecies false. Remember to remember what her face looked like in sleep. How the undying tugs at me, an animal within an animal, home to her still singing limbs.
Oh, wow. Oh,
I
that is
can
so,
see it.
that is just hits so many registers, Lindsay. Thank you so much for reading that and just for your presence. You always are such a calming force, I feel. You know, I feel that I'm so bonded to you, not only as, friends, but also you really recognizing and giving me courage to be my artistic self. So I want to thank you for that, Lindsay. You are a mentor of mine, and it means so much for me to see just your poetry and all your writing taking off. And I love the work that you do. I can't wait for your novel. So you'll have to come back when that happens. Um, so we can add novelist to your resume. Um, but Lindsay, oh, how can everyone find you? I know you have a website with all your work.
Yes, it's lindsaytuggle.com, I'm pretty sure. Just Lindsay. There are two Lindsay Tuggles. One is a filmmaker. So if you turn up on a filmmaker, that's not me, but Lindsay, I'm pretty sure it's just lindsaytuggle.com. Lindsay Tuggle will get you there. I'm also on Instagram as Lindsay Tuggle sporadically, but there.
Good,
And
good. So I have all the links to Lindsay's website, her Instagram, and our show notes so you can easily find it and get your hands on her work. Lindsay, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for joining me in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
thank you so much, Andrew. It's a delight.
Okay, bye to the audience and bye to Lindsay on the recording.